In 1865, Bedouin discovered 16 leather fragments east of the Jordan. I know what those fragments said. I call them the Moses Scroll. I'm Ross Nichols for HOREB Institute, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is Sunday School. I want to begin this session by reading an account from 1883. Pull up a chair. Shapira came to England and called upon me mysteriously. He had with him, he said, a document which would simply make students of the Bible and Hebrew scholars reconsider their ways. It would throw a flood of light upon the Pentateuch. What was his discovery? It was nothing less than a contemporary copy of the book of Deuteronomy written on parchment. A contemporary copy. It was written in fine black ink, as fresh after 3,000 years as when it was laid on, and in the Phoenician characters of the Moabite stone. It had been preserved, he told me, through being deposited in a perfectly dry cave in Moab. Then I suggested he should make this discovery known to the world. He consented after a while to reveal it to two persons, Dr. Ginsburg, the great Hebrew scholar, and Captain Conder, the surveyor of Western Palestine. I undertook to invite them to come on the morrow, but Ginsburg considered that the invitation included his friends, and so the whole of the British Museum, so to speak, with all the Hebrew scholars in London turned up, and with them Conder. Shapira unfolded his manuscript amid much excitement, such as seldom exhibited by scholars. The exposition lasted about 3 hours. Then Shapira tore off a piece of the precious document to show the nature of the parchment. It was, as one of the company remarked, a remarkable illustration of the arts as known and practiced in the time of Moses. Then Shapira withdrew, and after a little conversation, the learned company separated. As they went out, one of them, a professor of Hebrew, exclaimed with conviction, "This is one of the few things which could not be a forgery and a fraud." Then Conder, who had been very quiet, spoke. "I observe," he said, "that all the points objected to by German critics have vanished in this new and epoch-making trouvaille. The geography is not confused, and Moses does not record his own death." That is from the autobiography of Sir Walter Besant. I only read a selection of it. But Walter Besant was the first man in London that Shapira went to with his briefcase containing the 16 leather strips. You can find that book online. I'm going to cover several sources today, many of which are going to be in the description below. Now, I wanted to add a couple of pieces. I wanted to emphasize a couple of parts from what I just read in the autobiography of Walter Besant. He was the secretary of the Palestine Exploration Fund at the time and held that position for about 18 years. During much of the incredible finds of the 19th century, he was at the helm of the PEF. And if you notice, several points that we're going to talk about today, it was thought to be a book of Deuteronomy, some form of the book of Deuteronomy. He describes the black ink, which was very readable, at least in the piece that he saw. He describes the type of writing. He's describing it as a Phoenician-type script, very similar to what one finds on the Moabite stone or the Mesha stela. And then he talks about how this manuscript, the fragments, were folded and not rolled, as most people tend to think of scrolls. All this is going to play into an investigation. He mentions that in this document, the geography is not confused, as it is, implying that the canonical text, the geography is confused. And he also says that Moses does not record his own death in this particular manuscript. When I published the Moses Scroll in 2021, one of the things that I said is that this is a reopening of the most controversial case in the history of biblical scholarship. And I would add to that now that I'm entering into the 7th year of study of this manuscript, the arguments, the pros, the cons, everything that I've looked at over the last 6 years. I would add that the resolution of this case is, I would say, of the most consequential nature. This is the most consequential document ever, one way or the other, right? I don't know where you side at this point. I don't know how much you've read. I don't know if you've read any of the major books on the subject. We're going to talk about some of those today. But one of the main things that I want to do is, to begin with, is ask the question, what did the manuscript say? And maybe as important, what did it not say? What was in the manuscript fragments? What was not in? Now, this session today is going to be in 2 parts. We're going to have a brief overview, which I'm going to give, and then we're going to have a Zoom call afterwards. Now, those of you who've been with me a while know what this looks like. So in the Zoom call, I'm going to show quite a few photographs and documents and things like that, and we're going to have a conversation about what I cover here. Now, some of the resources that I think are important, I want to go through just because some of you may want to dive into this as well. One of the things that I want to bring up is this book is the first book. This was the introduction to the Shapira saga for me. Dr. James Tabor sent an email on December the 15th, 2019. I'd never heard of Shapira, never knew anything about his manuscript, but he read an article, and this book, by the way, is in the link. It is a fantastic book, very well written, but one of the things that it does not tell us is, what does the manuscript say? Very well written. The guy's an incredible author. But what I wanted to know, as I uncovered and I delved into the details of the case, was, what did it say? Now, the good part is that through reading that book, quite a few details emerged, and I was able then, not just me, but several others as part of a team, were able to dig into the details. The details drove what ultimately became the Moses Scroll. One of those details is that there is a dossier that is currently housed in the British Library. At the time, it was the British Museum, and it's called Additional Manuscript 41294. That's the catalog number. If you find yourself at the British Library, you can look it up and see all the documents that I'm talking about here, some of which I'll show you in the Zoom call. The title of that calling card number is Papers Related to Shapira's Forged Manuscript of Deuteronomy. Well, this is one of the biggest questions. Is it a forgery? Is it a fraud? Or is it the most consequential manuscript discovery of all time? You can tell probably that I side toward the latter and not the former. But plenty of people say, no, it's a forgery created in the 19th century. We're going to talk a little bit about that. This document that I'm describing, ADD MS 41294 in the British Museum, was a compilation of papers and newspaper clippings and drawings and various documents that were associated with the case in the late 19th century, and they were gifted to the British Museum by the widow of Christian David Ginsburg, who plays a very important part in the story of this scroll. It contains this dossier contains articles, drawings, photos, both by professionals as well as amateurs. And again, one of the things that we'll look at in the after class is an actual photograph of at least a fragment, a couple of fragments of this particular manuscript, or I should say more technically, manuscripts. But again, the photographs, like so many other attempts at the time don't have any discernible text. That's been 6 years, as I said. I published the Moses Scroll on the 24th day of February, 2021, and what is remarkable is that 2 weeks later to the day, mine comes out 24 February, 2 weeks later to the day, a New York Times article announced a new book. And the new book was written by a person who's a Harvard Society of Fellows scholar at the time, was teaching at the University of Potsdam in Germany, by the name of Idan Dershowitz. And he published a book and an article that goes along with it. The book is called The Valediction of Moses, a proto-biblical book. It is available. The link is in the description. It's available for free on academia, on his academia page, as a result of a nice, generous gift of a donor. And so that document is available free. I also recommend his accompanying article, which is called The Valediction of Moses, New Evidence on the Shapira Deuteronomy Fragments. As I prepared to publish my book, one of the things that I did was I prayed that somehow, some way, a scholar would pick up the case, because I felt like if a credentialed scholar, someone with a PhD in this particular field, would just look again at the evidence, because to me, the evidence was overwhelming in favor of the antiquity and authenticity of this scroll. And so that was my prayer. So you can imagine how delighted I was when I got the news that the New York Times was talking about the Shapira case. Wasn't talking about the Moses Scroll, my book, but nonetheless, the Shapira case hit the front news. Now, front page news. Now, let me say a couple of details as we get into the material. Remember, one of the things we want to do is talk about what does the manuscript say, what's in, what's not in the manuscript. I think one of the things that most people have not paid attention to, and it's really a shame, is a work that was published in 1883. It was published in 1883 on August the 31st, and it was by a scholar by the name of Hermann Goethe. The document, in English, the English translation, because it was only translated in German at the time, the English translation of which is called The Fragments of a Leather Manuscript Containing Moses' Last Words to the Children of Israel. As I dug into the details of the case, one of the things that really hit me was that I knew I needed to read this document. It was only available in German. So I started using online tools, Google Translate and various tools sometimes, and they're getting better, by the way. But at the time, that was all I had. And good friends of mine, Dave and Patty Tyler, asked me, what do you need to help facilitate the search? And I told them, I said, well, I don't know if you can help, but I need a German translator. And they happily told me that at their company, they have a whole division associated with translation. So they put me in contact with a translator, a German expert by the name of Mitchell Gold, and we published together this beautiful book. It is, for the first time in English, we published this, and I used a non-published version when I wrote the Moses Scroll. Subsequent to that, in 2022, this was published. It is so essential. I can't stress this enough. If you really want to understand what this manuscript says and the details that go into understanding it, you have to get this. Now, I'll tell you, it's got a lot of technical bits in it, so it's not like it's easy reading. Sections of it are quite easy. Others consist of 20 pages or more of Hebrew text, but it's very important if you want to understand that. Now, one of the things that is a real big takeaway in terms of understanding the Shapira manuscript fragments is that Goethe is where I learned that there's 16 leather strips in most of the things that I read up to that point, it kept saying 15, 15. Well, how do you go from 16 to 15? I give that in the Moses Scroll. It helped me put together an essential clue, and I believe that this one detail, where most people talk about 15 leather fragments, I know that there were 16. I think that this is actually going to help us not only crack the code, but potentially, hear me out, potentially find and be able to scientifically test and prove one way or the other the age of this manuscript, which I think will ultimately show to be ancient and authentic. But it all hinges on the fact that we know, according to Goethe, that there were 16 leather fragments. Now, there are many, many documents, not only before, like I have folders. I'm going to begin to share this on the Yakad in our group of supporters. I'm going to be able to begin sharing some of these documents for many of you who want to read the details that went into producing the Moses Scroll, and which will ultimately be used, hopefully, God willing, to find this manuscript. I'll be sharing those. So imagine before Don's book came out, there was quite a bit out there. I mean, I went through and downloaded and read and studied in order to put down a narrative for the story, the Shapira saga. I had to go in and read newspaper articles, and there are quite a few of them from London, and not only from London, but all over the world. This thing was front page news around the world. I found New York Times articles from the 1800s where people were literally sitting on the edge of their seat week by week waiting on news from London. But the piece that most missed was the German part. What was going on behind the scenes in Germany, and that's because only the English readers only had the English material. This book right here, this Fragments of Leather manuscript, and everything that went behind the scenes in that story, series of German letters from Leipzig that we subsequently found and translated, tell the behind-the-scenes story. So this today, we're going to get into what did this manuscript say, but I want to give you some details that you may not know. And again, in the after class, you'll see some diagrams and so forth. Here's one of the things that we know. Again, 16 fragments make up what are known as the Shapira Fragments. Now, when I say 16 fragments, this is presented as an ancient document which at one time they were connected with thread which was worn through. So we had 5 single documents, 5 single strips, and I'm going to hold up a model for you so you can kind of get an idea of what that looked like. This is the size, an average size, right? They're not all exactly the same size, but you can see that it's about 3.5 inches by 6 inches in centimeters. We're talking about 7.6 centimeters to 9.7 on the high range, which is 3 to 3.8 inches. That's how tall the strips were. And lengthwise, the strips were 15 to 16 centimeters or 5.9 to 6.3 inches. Now, we only know these dimensions because of Goethe's work. Goethe carefully measured these and took a lot of scientific data points that help us in the mystery. So you have some single strips. I have 5 strips, single, that were at one point connected, obviously, but they've become disconnected. Some of the strips were double. So I had two fragments that contain 2 columns each. And then I had 5 columns of 3, or 5 fragments of 3 columns, 2 fragments of 4 columns. Here's an example of one of those. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. This is an example. It's a little bit not to scale. It's a little bit bigger, but we'll be looking at that more detailed. And I just want you to understand that there were also 2 fragments with 5 columns of text. So all in all, when I say Shapira Fragments, I'm talking about 42 columns of text. 42 columns of text. Again, another very key piece of the puzzle is that these fragments were folded as such, letter side to letter side, backside to backside, and they were not rolled, at least not from the time Shapira came to possess the fragments. We don't know what they were like before. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details about the external characteristics of the fragments because I did another full session on that, the link of which is in the description. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this, even though it's not quite to scale. I want you to look at this just so that you can notice a few things that are important. Number one, notice that it's an arch shape. You see along the top, it's arched, it's warped, if you will, and the bottom edge looks more clean than the top. The top is a little bit more ragged. This led people in the 19th century to make a mistake. They felt like this proved, you had one jagged edge and one smooth edge, that they thought primarily some of the opponents of the authenticity, namely Clermont-Ganneau and others ultimately, but they believed that it was cut from the bottom of another scroll, from a normal synagogue scroll. By the way, everything, all of the arguments, I would argue, that all of the arguments which were made in the 19th century have been disproven now, for the most part, as a result of the remarkable discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Cave 1 and subsequent discoveries beginning in 1947. You know, all of the arguments like, oh, really? Bedouin discovered fragments in a cave by the Dead Sea, you say. Oh, they had a black sticky substance on the back. Oh, and there was linen stuck to it. Oh, I see. And you believe that this was able to survive in a cave for thousands of years? In fact, by the way, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, quite a few didn't want to touch the case because they felt like it was another Shapira story and they didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. So people doubted the authenticity of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Be that as it may, our fragments sound a whole lot like these other discoveries. Again, you have to watch my other video to get into the details of that. Now, not only this, by the way, this is a replica that's being sold. I believe you can still get it on eBay. It's not the real thing. Don't get excited. But someone took a photograph or made this replica from a drawing that is in ADD MS 41294 in the British Museum or in the British Library now. But they used that representation that Ginsburg commissioned in 1883 and made this. So it's quite interesting. Now, Ginsburg had to correct several early editions of this, and we see that in that dossier in the British Library. It shows where Shapira would where Ginsburg would mark it up and send it back to the artist and say, no, you need to draw these letters a little bit more carefully. Look, you made a mistake here, and so forth. But this is one of the ways that we can visualize at least one of the fragments. Remember, we had two fragments that had 4 columns each. This one has 4 columns. So we know that one of the 4 column pieces was column E. Fragment E is what we'll call it. We learn a little bit about this manuscript and what it said, not only based on this drawing and other drawings. Here I'm holding up, a little bit hard to see, but you can at least make out the shape. I got this offline. I bought it at an auction. This is actually, it was published in a newspaper in 1883, and it shows one of the fragments. And you can see that it's got a straight edge on the top, and the bottom has got some deterioration, some decay. We know from other Dead Sea Scrolls that that this is what Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient scrolls, look like, right? So a person in 1883, 70 years before the discoveries in Cave 1, is not going to know what to make them look like unless Shapira was some kind of clairvoyant or a prophet or something. So anyway, we've got several drawings and different transcriptions, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. One of the reasons that I like looking at these drawings and various things in these files is because I love Paleo-Hebrew, this early form of Paleo. A lot of people initially said, oh, it looks like the Moabite stone, and therefore whoever made these copied the letters from the Moabite stone, the Mesha Stela. That absolutely is not the case, because we have forms in the documentation that we have before us that we've now discovered that does not agree with the Moabite stone, nor does it agree with what was discovered in the Siloam inscription. Remember, Shapira comes to possess these fragments in 1878. The Siloam inscription wasn't discovered until 1880. By the way, Shapira happens to be the one who gives the proper interpretation on that. But that's a whole nother class. This whole Shapira world has become quite involved for me, as you can imagine. So when I study the Paleo, because I want to read as best I can from the drawings and various things that have survived, I want to be able to look at it in its earliest form. So we've got not only charts drawn by Gutta, which we'll look at in the after class, we've got charts in the file, in another file in the British library that have been discovered, where Ginsberg records his letter form chart of this particular document. And then we found a document in a German library that the Tylers financed. We were able to purchase this document and get it digitized. So I now have an entire book in Shapira's hands of Paleo letter forms. So all of that is stuff that I'm working on now. So 16 leather fragments make up not one manuscript. It's not technically the Shapira scroll. It's actually plural. We know that there were at least 2 copies of the same text, and there are hints based on what they could discern that there was a part of a third. So we have 2 duplicate texts, same text twice, and other fragments which look like they might belong to a third copy of this particular manuscript. Now, let me read you just a quote from Gutta. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons you need this book, because on page 26, he's talking about these 2 manuscripts. And he says, they agreed completely with each other up to a few small deviations that probably must be regarded as misspellings. Now, my own studies and studies of Edan and other folks who've dug deeply into this have discovered a few more differences. So, for instance, in one of the texts, there is a phrase that occurs in one of the manuscripts, but in the duplicate copy, it doesn't. We have some that have the same text twice, and in one, a word is spelled one way in one and one in the other. Now, all of these things aren't signs of forgery, but rather they would indicate to me more that they're authentic. If you're going to forge something and you're trying to pass it off, you would make every effort to get little details like that right. But we see different spellings even within the canonical text of the Bible, in the Masoretic text. We see different spellings at Qumran and so forth. So that's not a big deal, but it's interesting. Now, how do we know what it said? This is the key. 16 leather fragments, and they had to be deciphered. So you have to look at, the 19th century scholars had to look at the fragments, and they had to see what they could see, which I'll describe a little more detail in a minute. Then they had to transcribe it. So you take an ancient Paleo letter and you bring that into a modern Hebrew. Then you have to determine where to break the words, because this manuscript is written in continuous script. So there are no breaks between the words. It's just consistent, the letters. And then at the end of a line, sometimes a word, quite often actually in this manuscript, I've looked at it and typed it and written it by hand. I can't even tell you how many times. I almost know it by heart. I mean, it's a lot, but I've been doing this for 6 years now. But at times a line you'll get to the end of the line, and then the scribe will break a word in the middle and begin on the next line. Now look, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this was thought to be someone trying to make a document look ancient. And they said, this is what the critics said at the time, we know that you break a line, you break a word in the middle on a line on lapidary, like the Mesha Stela, other inscriptions, but no one did this in leather manuscripts. And written in Paleo on leather? No way. Well, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that is silly now. We know that. Here's another little model that I made for you. This is my same document, and I just wanted to show that one of the things that was consistent on these fragments is that on the left and right margin, the strip was scored. And at times, the scribe would go beyond the scoring. We believe that the scoring is drawn in a way to prepare the manuscript for the application of the text. But at times, the lettering would extend slightly beyond the score marks. And again, people said, oh, there you go, that's another sign of forgery. And now we have Dead Sea Scrolls that do the same thing. Not getting into that as much as you might like me to. I do some of that in the other video. So the scholars who looked at it at the time had to transcribe it to say, here's what the text says. The reason that this is so important, this book, The Fragments of a Leather Manuscript, is that Goethe and Meyer, Hermann Goethe and Edward Meyer, divvied up the strips, and they provide a transcription of everything that they could see in this particular document. I did that. I reproduced their transcription in that document. So let me tell you quickly about that transcription. It's one of, I'll tell you how many in a minute, but it's one of the transcriptions from, these people actually held the leather strips. They examined the leather strips in the reel. Edward Meyer and Hermann Goethe, and I tell the story in the Moses Scroll, in the first week of July, 1883, Shapira shows up with the leather fragments, and they met at the Hotel Haffa, which was situated, get this, you're not going to believe this, I think it's providential, at the corner of Ross Street and Ross Place. Now, what are the chances? Yep, that's right. That's my name. And they're meeting at Ross and Ross at the Hotel Haffa, and that's where they worked for 4 days. They couldn't work a full week because thunderstorms were so bad on the Friday that they didn't even have enough light to work on this particular manuscript. They just couldn't see well enough by the light of lamps in the hotel room. But their work, this is the only academic assessment of the fragments from the 19th century, and it was published on August 31st, 1883. Shapira leaves Germany and goes to England. I started with the account of meeting with Walter Besant. After that meeting, when Walter Besant scheduled the meeting that turns up all the scholars, Hebrew scholars of London show up, When they meet together at the end of July 1883, from that point, Ginsburg is assigned to assess these documents to see if they're ancient and authentic. So over the month of August, from the end of July until the end of August, Ginsburg, Christian David Ginsburg, he is well known even to this day as one of the greatest scholars of the Masoretic Bible ever who lived, right? I have a lot of his books on my bookshelf. I studied his work since the 1990s. So to find him engaged so much into the Shapira saga was quite a thrill for me. But Ginsburg produced a transcription of the manuscript that he published in 3 subsequent editions of a paper called the Athenaeum. So in the Athenaeum, in August of 1883, on August the 11th, the 18th, and the 25th, he published portions of the manuscript transcription in Hebrew. What I had to do was replicate that and write it letter by letter, and I've done that countless times. I'm even redoing that as we speak. This week, I'm working on a new, I guess you'd call it a Nichols revised version. I'm going back through that because now we found other transcriptions, corrections in the file, slight spelling corrections and so forth. So when I published the Moses Scroll, I had 2 transcriptions, the transcription of Gutta and Meyer and the transcription of Ginsburg. And I put those together in a single document in the book, and I footnoted every divergence but one between the other. If a guy saw an aleph and another guy saw another letter, I noted the discrepancy and did my best to produce what would best be defined as a text which gives you the best chance of seeing what it said. Now, after the publication of the Moses Scroll, 2 weeks later, when Edon's book came out, the big deal there was he discovered a 3rd transcription that no one knew about. And that transcription was a partial transcription, but nonetheless, it consisted of 3 purple pages, meaning there were pages with purple writing, and they were inside a catalog in the Staatsbibliothek, the Berlin State Library in Berlin, the State Library. There was a document that basically was a collection of Shapira's papers. Actually, what the document was, it was just a collection of these papers which detailed Shapira's manuscripts, because he was a known scroll merchant. He went all over the world. He was going to the Cairo Geniza before that was cool, before Schechter, before Solomon Schechter, before it was well known. He was going to Yemen in 1879 and hunting down ancient biblical manuscripts. And because of Shapira, we have some 140 plus of the most important earliest Masoretic manuscripts that we have today in not only the British Library, but in the Berlin Library and other libraries around the world, and in personal collections. Shapira had discovered some of the greatest manuscripts ever. So in a collection where he's detailing many manuscripts that he's discovered from all over the world and that he has in his collection, 3 pages. They're not even in order. In fact, they're exactly reversed. The first one appears on page 3, and that's then the next one appears 207 pages in, and then the final page appears on page 213. If you pull those pages out, Edon is brilliant at Hebrew. I mean, he's a natural Hebrew speaker, and he's a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. he immediately recognized this as Shapira's transcription of this manuscript. So you can imagine how excited he was. And one of the things that this discovery, he relates this in his book, The Valediction of Moses, a proto-biblical book. He shows that this proves that Shapira could not have been the forger because he's trying to figure out the order of the fragments. Remember, we have 42 columns of text, and Shapira is trying to put these together. Now, another thing that we know about this manuscript, not only is it in at least two, but there are two different scribal hands. So it's a little bit easier to separate the pieces into a flowing narrative because you know that this is the same hand. Oh, and at the end of the line on column 1, I'm making this up, it breaks the word and the word begins again on the next column. So you know those goes together. In one of the manuscript copies, there are 10 lines of text consistently, except for one portion. I'll talk about that in the after class. And then the other manuscript has 12 lines. So there are ways to tell and ways to put this together. All of this builds in order for us to know what the manuscript says. By the way, since the publication of Edon's book, I then had 3 transcriptions from the 19th century, and I've published those. The link is in the description on my academia page, one on top of the other. This is a Hebrew manuscript I've worked on. I have Shapira's transcription until it runs out. It's a partial transcription that Edon discovered. It goes through about halfway through the document. So I have Shapira's Hebrew transcription, then we have Gutemeyer, and then Ginsburg, and all of those can be compared letter by letter, word by word. In addition to the Hebrew, in the 1800s, Ginsburg also published an English translation that is also available. It was published in the Athenaeum as well as in the Times of London in the 1800s, and then that was spread out through syndicated papers around the world so that they could read and anticipate what's the next section of the Shapira manuscript to hit the press. So here's what we know. The manuscript, the fragments closely resemble, let me say this carefully, they resemble the book of Deuteronomy, but with many notable variations. What did it say and what didn't it say? Both of those questions are important. So let me give you a high-level overview. These are the notes that I took. I don't know how many times I'd read through it, but this is a very high-level overview of the text. Moses begins with a travel itinerary from HOREB to Kadesh Barnea. There is a command from Elohim, from God, to go up and possess the land. The people refuse to do this. Elohim then responds with a sentence, basically, that says, because you refuse to go up and possess the land from Kadesh Barnea, then I can tell you this, I'm paraphrasing, only your little ones and Caleb and Joshua will go in and possess the land. The people die off, and it says that the journey resumes from Kadesh Barnea for the rest of the route to the crossing over into the Transjordan. Battles along the way, the encounters with various people are recorded. The incident at Beit Peor, where we have the Midianite women and the Moabite women and all of that bad story, it's in there. Moses relates Elohim's charge to teach statutes and judgments, and they are not to add to or take away from what is about to be communicated. And here's the kicker. What is communicated is the Shema and the 10 words. the Shema and the 10 words. And I say that in that order. In the canonical text, remember the 10 words are given and then the Shema, but here it's the other way around. Quite interesting. Moses, in this account, receives 2 tablets of stone relaying the 10 words that were communicated from Horeb. It's always called Horeb in this document, never Sinai. The account of the molten calf, the tablets are shattered, a second set is made. There is a blessing and curse ceremony at Ebal and Gerizim, and that ceremony is fully conveyed. By the way, those blessings and curses correspond to the 10 words. So you have a word, a declaration, part of the Decalogue in this document has a corresponding blessing and a corresponding curse. We'll break this down more later. Moses, after this, signs off. He's 120 years old. He says he's not going to be crossing. Joshua's going to lead them. And the final word is a charge from Elohim. Be strong and courageous. Don't fear. It's from Moses about Elohim. And he says, Elohim will go before you. Now I want to hit some of the high points. I want to hit some of the striking features of this manuscript. It's first person throughout. In other words, in the Pentateuch, we have around 600 references to Moses. Moses can't be mentioned in a first-person document in the body of the document itself, right? In other words, third person, I've done many, many classes on this. The Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch as we have it, says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, and Moses did this, and Moses did that. None of that appears. It's all first person. Moses will speak, but he says, and I said unto you, and you said unto me. But, here's the whole thing. It's all first person. There's no narrator in the body of the text. The only third person voice is at the beginning and the ending of this manuscript. That is clearly a later edition. I'm going to read you those 2 points just so you know this is the only exception. Here's what it says at the beginning, obviously a later scribe. These are the words that Moses spoke according to the mouth of Jehovah to all of the children of Israel in the wilderness across the Jordan in the Arabah. Then the manuscript officially begins. Elohim, our Elohim, spoke to us in Horeb, saying, you've dwelt here at this mountain long enough. All right, goes on and on and on. And the ending of the document says, these are the words that Moses commanded to all the children of Israel according to the mouth of Jehovah in the plains of Moab before his death. All the rest is first person. Now, by the way, the only place that the Tetragrammaton, you heard me read Jehovah, the English translation Jehovah, and I know that's a total fight among people that are interested in the Bible. Whether you say Yahweh, Yahuwah, Hashem, that is the only occurrence in the late edition, the editorial comment at the beginning and the end. It's the only place the name appears. According to this document, God is referred to as Elohim, and the only exception to that is an interesting passage. Let me read it to you. And a lot of people who've studied this document miss this, but it's here it says in GB, in other words, fragment G, column B, it says, Elohim attached with your fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them from all the people, because Elohim, your Elohim, he is Elohim of Elohim and master of master, Lord of lords, the mighty and awesome El. He is your boasting, and it is he who does the great and awesome things with you. So Elohim is the sole title, with the exception here where the Hebrew gives a little bit more. He calls him It's forms of the word Adon, Adon, Adoni, the mighty and awesome El. I love that. It might be a good t-shirt idea. Even the Shema. You're familiar with the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4 in the canonical, in the Masoretic text. Here, the Shema says, Shema Israel, Elohim, Elohim, Eloheinu, Elohim Echad. Hear, O Israel, Elohim, your Elohim, Elohim is one. Now, I know some people have argued that that's tautological. We can talk more about that later. It is not. In fact, we have examples of that in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in what are known as the Elohist Psalms. And Edan Dershowitz has done quite a bit on that. Now, there's no anachronism in this document. What is anachronism? It's where something from a later time is interpolated into the body of a text. If someone is talking, if I present to you a story about Shakespeare and I tell you, look, we found a document that Shakespeare wrote, and in that Shakespearean document, it says that he posted something on X or he posted on Facebook. Clearly, that is out of place. It didn't happen in the time of Shakespeare. That's an obvious one. That's an easy one. Well, we have some that are that easy in the Pentateuch, where we find something that was written later, which is inserted in. A big example is the death of Moses. Moses did not write about his own death. We have other examples where Exodus 16 talks about how the manna was eaten by the children of Israel for 40 years until they came into the promised land. Exodus 16, they've not even reached Sinai yet. They've not even reached HOREB yet to receive the 10 words, and they're not even in the life of Moses going to cross into the land, right? So that's another one. We wouldn't generally expect, aside from anachronism, we wouldn't expect for the most humble man in the world to write that he is the most humble man, and so forth and so on. There are no references in this document, in the Moses scroll, to a phrase that we see in the Pentateuch, unto this day, right? That's something a contemporary writer is not going to write because it doesn't mean anything. If you write unto this day, there's never arisen a prophet greater than Moses unto this day. Well, if he just died, that's not a big deal, right? But if it's written hundreds of years later, you say, well, now that's something important. Here are a couple of other striking features of this document. There's no mention of Aaron. There's no mention of priest or priesthood or sacrifices. There's no mention of the monarchy. Wow. You say, well, Ross, we know that the monarchy is mentioned in Deuteronomy 17. It says that when you come into the land, you're going to ask for a king like the nations, and you can appoint a king over you. And most people say, yes, Moses wrote that. No, he didn't, because when we meet that situation, when it actually happens in 1 Samuel 8 and 10 and 12, Samuel doesn't know anything about a rule about that they were going to ask for a king. Because if he would have known, he would have said, oh, yeah, that's right. I knew they were going to ask for a king, and here it is. Even God doesn't remind him of it. So this is a later addition into the text. Our text doesn't have that. Here's a big one. The only festival, and it's not called a festival, is Shabbat. None of the other holy days are mentioned in this document. Now, you do with that what you want. We can talk about that. The 10 words in this manuscript are different than the canonical text, but that's not a huge deal, really, because we have two versions, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, and they have differences between them. So we have now a different set of 10 words, and they're quite interesting. In fact, in the description, you'll see a link. Seth made a beautiful poster of these 10 words, which we have here at the building. It's quite interesting. Fascinating set of 10 words. And by the way, this document, it has 10 declarations. You say, well, so does Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Not really, because no one knows how to count them. In order to get 10, Catholics and Lutherans and Jews, and these are all groups have subdivisions, disagree on how the 10 declarations are divided. In order to get 10, you either have to split the first declaration, where it's, some say, well, this isn't really part of it. It's God announcing, I'm God, I brought you out of the, and then the second one is don't make idols, and, people break those differently. Or you break the end. You either say, you take a declaration which deals with coveting your neighbor's property and his wife and so forth, and they'll split that one to make 10. But they're really only 9. This document has 10, and they're easy to count because after every one, it signs off, Anochi Elohim Elohecha. I am Elohim, your Elohim. And then the next one starts the next line. So you can count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And as I mentioned, the blessings and curses, which are mentioned later in the document, correspond to the blessings and curses. So you have to the declaration has a corresponding blessing and curse. In the Hebrew, every one of the words within the declarations is divided with an interpunct. This only happens scattered throughout the document. But in the Decalogue, after each of the words, Anochi, dot, Elohim, dot, Elohecha, dot. These word separating dots were thought to only be presented on stone, on lapidary inscriptions. And that's what people thought in the 1800s. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, those which were written in Hebrew, in Paleo-Hebrew, had interpuncts, these separating dots. Shapira could not have known that. Again, the 10 words correspond to the blessings and curses, and Deuteronomy has a description of there's going to be blessings and curses, but it only gives the curses. This is something quite interesting. In Deuteronomy, we're introduced to the ceremony which is to take place at Ebal and Gerizim. In that document, in Deuteronomy, we begin talking about it in Deuteronomy 11, and then it's interrupted with 15 chapters, chapter 12 through 26, which have nothing to do with the blessings and curses that's being described. And then it just picks it back up. And if you pull that chapter 12 through 26 out, they go together. Interestingly enough, the law code, which is what we call chapter 12 through 26 of Deuteronomy, is considered by scholars to be the latest, and not only does it interrupt it, but it has this idea that we have more than 100 laws in Deuteronomy 12 through 26 that we see nowhere else in the 5 books. So that's interesting. Our document doesn't have that. It does have the ceremony, does have the blessings and curses, and they do correspond to the 10 words. The Hebrew text of the Shapira Fragments is about the same. It's almost identical to what we find in the book of Hosea. If you look at the book of Hosea, just to give you an idea of how big the document is roughly 1,900 to 2,000 words in Hebrew, just like our document. And it would take you approximately 20 minutes to read this document. It depends on, I don't know how fast you are at Hebrew, but if you read Hebrew, or if you read English, you can read it in about 20 minutes. My question is, have you read it? Do you have half an hour? I mean, if this proves to be as consequential a manuscript as I propose and others have proposed that it is, could you not take 20 minutes and read it? By the way, You can read it in a couple of places. You can read it in the Moses scroll. You can read it in the valediction of Moses. Both of those are linked in the description. We have still many, many questions that are unanswered. We have mysteries that are unsolved. I work on this case every day of my life. At some point, I'm working on it every week quite a bit. We're still looking for the manuscripts. We're following clues. We have hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, we have hundreds of documents. I'm now looking at those documents using prompts with tools that we didn't have when I began this search. And it is going to help, I guarantee you. So where are the fragments now? That's one of the big questions. Well, I can't tell you that. Well, if I knew, I would already have them. But we're getting close. I think we're getting close. We've narrowed the search. And if we find those, let me be positive and say, when we find at least one of those fragments, and if we test it, let's just say it turns out to be ancient and authentic, then some of these other questions will be resolved for sure. But don't let anybody tell you, well, it doesn't matter about this scroll because we don't have the text. Oh, we have the text. We don't have the manuscripts. Well, how different is that from many people's Bible today, right? So we're looking for the actual manuscript which underlies the transcriptions that we currently have. The search is on. So let me ask you this. Are you interested in joining the quest? Well, follow us at HOREB, because this is one of the main things we're going to be doing. 2026 is going to be a year focused a lot on Shapira. So join me on that quest. And for those of you who are here with me today, join me in the Zoom call. If you're not part of the Yakad, you'll be redirected to watch a part of that on YouTube. So stick around. We're going to show some pictures and some charts and diagrams, and you're going to be able to ask questions, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for joining me.